Be inspired by the best sales professionals, sales leaders, and coaches in the world of B2B sales. From IT services, medical devices, through to coaching and consulting companies, these principles will help you accelerate your sales performance and growth. Using models from the best-selling book Inspire, Influence, Sell, and award-winning programs from Focus for Growth, you'll have the inside track on the psychology, skills, and systems used by the world's best sales teams. We'll hear from some of the best sales leaders from some of the fastest growing businesses in the world. They don't achieve record-breaking growth by chance. They have a proven sales and leadership approach and a laser focus on growth. You can hear exactly how they do it, one conversation at a time. This is the Inspire Sales Podcast, and I'm your host, Justin Lee. Welcome to the Inspire Sales Podcast. Today, you're joining me live during one of our leadership workshops. Every week, we run a leadership workshop covering a different topic of leadership. And in this episode, we're going to be joining a group where we discuss the implications as leaders of not listening carefully to our teams and not asking the right questions. We then look at how to structure questions, how to ask higher quality questions of our teams so that we start to coach them by default rather than being overly directive, because that becomes a trap for both the manager, who then becomes reliant upon by his team for direction, his or her team for direction and too much information. Whereas when we start to ask questions and listen, we get higher levels of engagement and it becomes more rewarding and satisfying to lead a business team where you strengthen people's capability. So I hope you enjoy this session today, and I look forward to seeing you at the end. So we'll talk about questioning and we'll talk about listening this morning. And the way that we structure these workshops, I try and make them kind of like 3/3. The first third of today's session, about 15 minutes, I'll just talk about some principles. And I'll kind of lay out some foundations that hopefully just get you thinking differently about perhaps the approach you're taking today. And then the second third, I'll open up the group to breakout rooms and I'll give you the opportunity to talk with each other. And those of you who've joined us before will know the format. And that will give you a chance to talk about what you're doing today, what you think about the principles we've discussed and how they might change and improve what you're doing today. And then the final third is us regrouping and just taking some feedback from your discussions, because you'll all be sharing different kind of principles, different actions that you want to take. And there's learning in all three of those different segments of the session today. So hopefully learning some principles, being able to discuss it with your peers so that you start to process it. So this is what I think I need to change or improve. And then finally feeding back and hearing everyone's feedback, because you'll get learning from that as well. And then we'll close the session, and we will close before 10 o'clock UK time. So we'll close by about 5:02 to give you 5 minutes before your 10 o'clock meetings. How does that sound to everybody? Okay.
Yep, cool.
Brilliant. Thank you. Excellent. Well, again, huge thanks for joining me this morning. These sessions only work because you show up. Otherwise, I'd be standing here on my own, which has happened. It has happened, I promise you. But this morning, we'll look at how we use questions to create solutions in our business. Because very often as leaders, I've found this in many businesses I've led, you tend to find yourself in a position where you're the go-to person for all the answers. And if you early in your career, that's probably a good thing. As you go through your career, it becomes a bit of a burden and it can be tiring, it can weigh you down. So we have to start to switch the perspective and switch responsibility from ourselves to our teams. And we do that through questioning and listening. And we'll look at three things this morning. We'll look at how to really listen to our teams. And that sounds obvious, but I'll talk about why that's not quite so difficult this morning. We'll look at how we ask better quality questions. And then we'll look at questions as a tool for change, and then I'll hand over to you to discuss that with your groups. Okay, so I love this quote about dependency. Our dependency can make slaves out of us, especially if it's a dependency of self-esteem. Sometimes, and I've experienced this with clients I work with, sometimes we get self-esteem from having answers for our teams, right? But if we need that encouragement, praise, or pats on the back from everybody that we work with, then we make everybody either our judge or we become a slave to them. We have to be really careful that we recognize when there's an opportunity for us to not give people answers and question instead. It's a really interesting skill to start to develop as leaders in our businesses. So for us, many of you will have seen this before. This is the kind of framework that I use for client work, for our leadership development program, our coaching leaders program, which is also the same model from the book that I wrote called Coaching Leaders. So do feel free to look that up. But we're really kind of in the coach for change stage of the process today. So we won't look at coaching specifically, but the precursors to coaching are questioning and listening. And listening is really interesting. Let's start with listening, because I've had this experience in my career where I've learned coaching skills. I've started to coach people, and then I find myself distracted or tuned out. And then I think I've just asked a really good question. I've got no idea what they said. And then I've got to try and pick up the pace and pretend that I'm continuing the conversation. I don't know if that's happened to you. I've also had it the other way around, where someone's asked me a question, I've answered, and I can tell that I haven't listened. And then I have to either repeat myself, or it just feels really like it just disconnects you. It's a bit of a withdrawal from the emotional bank account, I always find. So listening is really important, and it's a skill we have to start to cultivate. And the reason listening is difficult, so these are stats from the International Listening Association. The reason it's so difficult is because we speak at between 125 and 175 words per minute. Okay, so that's the average speaking rate. But we're able to listen at closer to 450. So you can notice this immediate disconnect. Our capability of listening is so much greater than someone's capability for speaking that sometimes we get bored, or we just think, why won't they hurry up and get to the point? And if you ever find yourself thinking that, you're not alone. It's a very common problem. And then thirdly, we think at between 2,000 and 3,000 words a minute. So if you could put all the images, all the senses that we have into words, it would be between 2,000 and 3,000 words. It's the brain processing speed. So you can see that actually sometimes it's quite difficult. And if we don't intentionally tune into someone, it's very easy for us to overlook listening. And what that means for most people is that we absorb between 17 and 25% of what we hear. Now, we're talking about ourselves as leaders. That's true for our teams as well. It's really important that we recognize this gap and potential flaw in ours and our team's abilities to listen. And fun fact for you, the number one reason marriages fail is because one or the other partner doesn't feel listened to. So this doesn't just affect us professionally, this affects us personally as well. And so what we need to start to think about is how do we tune in? How do we become more active listeners? And there's this, I love this kind of analogy for listen, right? So the L is look interested and get yourself interested. Sometimes that might be something you have to do intentionally. The I is involve yourself by responding when someone's talking, because that keeps you engaged in the listening process. The S is to stay on target. Don't be distracted. If things are happening in the background, stay on target with the person you're listening to, really tune in. And it's interesting, I do a lot of coaching, one-to-one coaching. And when I do that, I tend to do it in like a hotel. So we'll do it in a hotel, restaurant, or somewhere like that. And there's always something going on in the background. And I will often sense my clients being distracted by that. But I've been doing this now for about 6 years. I've now learned to just completely tune out of anything in the background and just tune in on the person. But it's taken me a long time to practice to stay on target in listening. And then the T is test your understanding. And the test your understanding is, paraphrase, ask checking questions. Just double check that throughout the conversation, you are understanding what's being said, because sometimes you might be slightly off and someone can then clarify, and it helps them to get that sense that you're really understanding what they're saying. The E is evaluate the message. Just make sure that what is being told, what you are being told is true, and that you're kind of gathering the right information. And then the N is sometimes people will tell us things that might spark emotion in us. So often we might have to neutralize our own feelings when we're being told something, perhaps by our teams, that we don't want to hear. If they're not going to make certain achievements, targets, or goals, sometimes we might find ourselves jumping in and saying, well, I can't accept that, or what are you going to do instead? And actually sometimes just listening to people right the way through can be really useful. So active listening is an important skill for us to develop. And when we're doing it, some of this is common sense, some of it is useful to remind ourselves of, but we repeat key words that our team members are using. And that repetition and like paraphrasing, mini summaries, really acknowledges that we're listening and reinforces that we've understood what they're saying and what they need, if it's a case of us understanding if they need something from us. And then, of course, at the end, and I'm a big fan of summaries, just at the end to summarize the discussion. So what you're saying is, and just 3 or 4 bullet points about what they've said. The thing about doing that is it helps sometimes people process, especially if you've had a deep conversation about lots of things. It helps everyone to come back to simple principles that you then want to cover. And of course, it forces, if you're going to summarize every time you have a conversation, you have to listen. It forces you to be more attentive. That's what I've found. It actually becomes self-fulfilling. The more you summarize, the more you have to tune in, because you have to listen to be able to do the summary at the end anyway. And of course, that improves our ability to influence people positively, so that they get the results they're looking for. They increase responsibility, and as leaders, it makes our jobs easier. So listening is a real key to us being able to do this. So I'll invite you to think about what you need to do to improve your listening skills, but I'd also like to just quickly touch on questioning. And then once I've done questioning, then we'll open up some breakout rooms, and I'll invite you to think about, okay, what might you need to focus on in terms of improving your listening, and to start to think about the questions that you ask. So listening is really important, as we said. Questioning is also important. One of the things that I noticed, I spent a lot of time as a sales manager and a business manager, so I did a lot of coaching with my teams. One of the things I noticed became a default with people that I work with, and I hadn't realized until I was in a leadership position, was that a lot of people default to closed questions. So they'll automatically say, are you okay? Have you done this? Can you do this? Would you do this? Should we be doing this? And it's closed, closed, closed. What that means is you end up in conversations where people will give you answers that are yes or no. And sometimes I've found this myself as a leader. It can be frustrating. You think, why don't I get more information out of people? Why aren't they just opening up a bit more? And it wasn't until I recognized actually it's the type of questions we ask on default that tend to shut people down or give us yes, no answers. So what we need to kind of start to consider is that there are 3 types of questions, and closed questions are probably the least effective, unless we just want someone to say yes or no, right? But we tend to default to them. And after today's session, I'd love for you to start to look at the people that you work with, your teams. Start to notice the questions they ask, because you'll start to notice that people default to yes or no questions. And I do client work all the time. I've been out 3 days this week with clients, and it's something we focused in on. And over the course of our program together with my client team, they started to notice the number of closed questions that were just asked automatically in their business. And so they're making now a conscious effort to open things up, to try and get more information, more openness from their teams, especially when it comes to kind of coaching conversations and helping people to think about change and what they're going to do differently. But there are 3 types of questions. I won't talk about closed questions because they come far too naturally to us, but we will talk about the other 2 types of questions. So open questions and probing questions. Okay, so open questions are obviously questions that get people talking. Probing questions are questions we ask when we perhaps have got some information, but we want to go a little bit deeper. We think we've got a kind of surface-based answer. We want to go a little deeper and get real clarity from people. So the way we do that, simplest way, open questions, the easiest way to remember it is that they begin with what or how. And if we ask people what or how questions, no matter what situation we're in, if we can start to default and ask, what is the situation, or what have you been working on, or how are things going, or how would you like to change what you're doing today? We start to use those what or how question structures. It completely changes the dynamic of our conversations, and it gets our teams to open up. And through that opening up, you tend to find that relationships improve as well. So they're really powerful. And one of the things that comes up often for me is people say, well, what about asking why? Isn't why an open question? And why is an open question? Absolutely. The challenge with a why question is that why tends to create defensiveness in people. So if I say to somebody, why have you done that? They'll tend to then feel like they have to justify themselves. And it's hardwired from childhood when we get asked why a lot in a negative context. And so when we're asking questions that begin with why, we just have to be really selective about what we ask. And I always think about two situations where I ask why questions. One is, I call it in reverse. So instead of why did you do that, it might be why is it important that you make a change? So it's getting people to reverse out of their situation, not stay stuck in it. And then the second is about unlocking motivation and passion. So I might say to somebody, why is this so important to you? And that's a really powerful question then if I use it in the right context. But you can see that using it in the wrong context can really start to undermine the relationship and actually create defensiveness. And I've been in situations in the past with team members before I learned these principles, and I would ask a question like, why did you do that? And then I'd be thinking, and I'd get into these conversations, I'd be thinking, where's this? How have I got to this point where the person in front of me is so defensive? And actually, it's all to do with the questions that I asked and the way I asked them without realizing, it's completely unconscious. So as leaders, sometimes we have to go back and cover some of these fundamentals so that we can really start to get the best from our teams, the best from those relationships and the coaching conversations that we have with them. So that's open questions. So then finally, probing questions. So we might ask a question of your team, why is that so important of you? Or, what have you been working on? And they give you an answer that's perhaps not as in depth or not giving you the information you want. So we then probe. So we might just say, it's really simple, just say, what else have you been working on, or what else did you find when you were doing that? Or you might simply say, yeah, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Just tell me a bit more about it. And as simple as that sounds, these are really often overlooked. We ask a question, get an answer, kind of go, that's not what I wanted, and move on. When actually we just need to probe a little more, go below the surface and help our teams to be able to get that kind of clarity over their own thinking as well. And that's the thing about questions. It helps our teams and people we're working with to get that clarity for themselves as well as clarity for us when we're having these conversations. So that's the content part of this morning's session. So questioning and listening, but in the other way around, in the other order, right? Listening first, because what we don't want to do is undermine the great work we do by asking good questions. We have to learn to tune into people first. And sometimes that takes a little intention from ourselves. And we might need to think about some of the habits we've currently formed and how we start to change those habits to become better listeners and ask better questions. I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Inspire Sales podcast. As I say, this time it was a leadership edition, and joining us live for one of our leadership workshops that we run each week. If you'd like to join us for one of our workshops, or if you'd like more information about the programs or the work we do, then feel free to contact me. My details and contact information is on the YouTube channel, and it's in the show notes for this episode. Thanks for listening all the way through, and I look forward to seeing you at a future episode. Genuine thanks for listening to the Inspire Sales podcast. We hope you enjoy learning some of the most cutting-edge sales techniques and getting close to some of the greatest sales leaders in the world now and in the future. If you'd like to explore further, please feel free to visit our website, focusforgrowth.co.uk. And if you'd like to take our Sales Acceleration Scorecard and discover your sales and influencing score, then check out the show notes for the link in the bio. If you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the subscribe button. If you know people in your sales and leadership network that you think would like to listen to, then please share this episode with them. I'd be very grateful. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please feel free to do so. If you have suggestions for further guests, or if you'd like to appear yourself, please contact me or my team. You can connect with me. I'd love to hear from you. My social profiles are in the show notes, and I look forward to being with you on the next episode. Thanks again for listening. See you soon.